Hi everyone, my name is Josh. Welcome today to Josh's Bookish Voyage. I'm here to talk to you about what just might be my favorite book and easily my favorite nonfiction book of 2023. UFO by Garrett and Graff is a book that presents itself as the inside story of the US government's search for UFOs and life on Earth and outside of it, or alien life specifically. Why I am interested in this book and why I think you might be or should be is a nuanced conversation. I want to set up the story of why I was brought to this book in the first place. I'm a planetary scientist and astrobiologist, a geologist, geophysicist more than an astronomer, but my work intersects with the search for life or habitable environments on extraterrestrial worlds, specifically planetary worlds in our solar system. I also consider myself a skeptic, someone who loves Carl Sagan, who was a major pusher of the idea of, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I never gave much thought to UFOs, or rather, I never gave much weight to them being a serious thing beyond, just the bare definition of unidentified objects. But when the government released a bunch of documents, its UFO files, in recent years, it did, I don't want to say pique my interest, but it was something that I knew I should look into. As a scientist, I also know how the scientific community works. If there was anything significant in those files, it would just completely dominate the scientific community, and it would not be hidden. That's just how the scientific community works. Nevertheless, I have very strong opinions, and if I'm going to continue dismissing UFOs as a serious thing to be concerned about, or seriously believe that aliens have visited Earth, I should look into it more. I can't say that I actively searched out for UFO by Garrett and Graff. I think it was just one of those books where I was looking at what's coming out and I saw this book. The author is one big reason why I decided to give this book specifically a chance. He's known for books like Watergate: A New History, or perhaps even more well known from a couple of years ago, The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11. These books were, at least the 9/11 book was a bestseller, and I know it received a lot of accolades for its being very well documented work. And in my mind, it means something that this author has a somewhat reputable history of reporting government information. That doesn't mean I came in expecting it to be an all-time hit. I've actually never read any of his works. I'm interested in his works, but rather it was his perspective as a journalist that drew me to this book specifically. And it was, of course, also my wanting to better understand how these new documents that have been released fit into the broader conversation of UFOs that made me think to myself, this is a book I should consider giving a shot. That said, that doesn't mean it's going to be a good book. There were 1,000 ways this kind of story could be told, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a effective book, let alone a truly informative book. And not to spoil the whole review, but I think it does just that. It approaches this problem in a way that I feel like just really does it justice. When we think about our fascination with UFOs, it's easy to fixate on anecdotal evidence, but the reality is that anecdotes are not reliable. While it's easy to fixate on anecdotal evidence, especially when there's so many of them, it's important to approach this kind of problem, this extraordinary claim, from a scientific perspective, one where extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's important to recognize how society's sort of existing mythos feeds into these types of experiences, and they can't all be real. Before there were UFO sightings, there were angels and demon encounters. I understand how someone can become fascinated with UFOs. I mean, I'm fascinated with the concept of life. That's why I'm in the field that I am. I understand that fascination. But it's also really important that we don't let our own personal desire for something to be true to drive us to believe things that just aren't true. One, because it distracts from what is the real truth, or keeps us from investing in things that would actually get us closer to the truth, like, say, some of the actual missions that are going out to look for life now that I'll touch on later in this discussion, which is why I think it is important to approach this conversation from a nuanced and well-rounded perspective. And I think that's what makes this book thrive, is because it provides us with that perspective. I've already given a lot of details about how this book is approaching this problem, but let me just sort of outline it for you. The book starts out really with the earliest cases of UFO sightings. It takes us back into the early 1900s, late 1800s, wherein the first sort of cases come about. It acknowledges that these exist, and it also discusses how the government begins to approach these type of claims or experiences that people are claiming are happening. One thing I should say is that this book is not a comprehensive review of all the different alien or UFO encounters in the world. And I say alien because there have been people who actually have claimed to be visited by aliens, legitimately believe that. But one of the reasons this book is so strong is because rather than try and give a comprehensive overview, which I believe would be not just monotonous, but also dull, it would also be, I think, misleading and not very informative. Our goal here is to understand these UFO sightings, these UFO experiences, in the context of how the government has searched into it and the scientific community's exploration of the topic. I don't think we should need every single case to make that point. Granted, there's a level of trust that we have to put into the author to not misrepresent what's going on, which is one of the reasons why I think the question of why this book at all is a major question that we have to ask ourselves before we pick it up, because we have to understand and be able to trust the perspective of the person doing the writing. I've made my case of why I feel like this was a good enough person to trust in this approach, but ultimately I guess that's your own issue you'll have to look into. But from my perspective, I felt like we were given a good look at some of the most intriguing cases and some of the earliest cases and understand how the government looked into it. There were various experiences where the government can recognize, oh, this is what this was. It almost certainly was not anything more than that. But then there are cases where they just can't, that we don't know. It's important to also recognize just because we don't know what something is, it's a far cry from saying it is something completely alien. This is what we talk about when we say extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary claims.
Extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary claims.
A lack of evidence is not an evidence for something, especially when that something is so far removed from the reality as we understand it to be. That conversation isn't overtly touched on immediately. I mean, it becomes clear that there's a lot of unknowns going on here, with some things being just easily misrepresented. And the reason I like how he approaches that topic is because I feel like even though we don't get an answer right away, acknowledging that there are answers for some of these cases, I think shows how, one, these are clearly not all aliens. And once you can recognize that, you can begin to recognize how a world without aliens could still have an abundance of claims of aliens. And that's an important foundation to lay in this entire conversation. Sure, we can't dismiss things, but why we shouldn't make jumps to certain conclusions is something that I think becomes more grounded as we begin to see the scientific discussion get more integrated in the story. And that's really where the story starts to go. Early on, I enjoyed the book, but I was a little, not disappointed, just a little removed. I didn't find it the most engaging, partly because it was largely just, a history of UFO encounters and how the government involved, which is exactly what the book sells itself to be. But what we see is as these experiences mature and as time matures, so does the scientific community's interest in the material. And it feels like the scientific perspective almost begins to dominate the story. And personally, I think it should. Obviously, I'm biased, I'm a scientist, but I think it's important to see, one, UFOs are not being ignored. I mean, the idea of aliens is not being ignored. It's being seriously considered. What's more, in contrast to UFOs specifically, we're beginning to be introduced to the concept of the search for life at a larger scale, understanding that there is no good evidence that life has visited. I'm saying no external life, AT life, has visited us. But that doesn't mean there aren't legitimate reasons to suspect there is life out there, and there isn't legitimate reasons or ways in which we could engage with that life. That really is what introduces us to astrobiology as a subject, one field that I'm in. It introduces us to the search for extraterrestrial through radio telescopes. If you've ever seen the film Contact with Jodie Foster, that's a perfect example of what's going on. That movie and that story is talked about, as is Carl Sagan extensively. Carl Sagan, Jill Tarter, all these major figures have been discussed. They also talk about other scientists who give UFOs perhaps a bit more credence than they should. There's a fine line you have to walk when you begin to approach these topics because they are so fringe. It's easy to get yourself sort of thrown out of the conversation, or thrown out of the community as a serious scientist. You might say to that then why should we trust science? And while I understand that response, I also think it's important to recognize that there is a fine line to walk. Carl Sagan, someone who I love and adore, was also oftentimes dismissed as not being serious because he spent so much time, one, on communication of science, but also two, in the idea of looking for life. SETI, for example, where we basically are just investing in giant telescopes to try and recognize signals. The point I'm trying to make is that there is a balance that can be had, that people not just dismissed for approaching fringe ideas. How they approach it, how they discuss it, is really important. It really makes a big difference on how seriously you end up being taken. A good example of that, I think, was one of the later discussions, one of the later figures we were discussing, which is Avi Loeb, who was a Harvard astronomer. He was in the news in the last several years because when the very first interstellar object visited, or rather flew near Earth, it was the first ever interstellar object that we saw, which is to say an object not from within our solar system, not a comet from out near Pluto, but rather literally an object that almost certainly came from entirely outside of our solar system. It came, flew by Earth, and it was gone like that. Unfortunately, because of how quickly it came and went, we don't know a lot about it. There's a lot of unknowns. It has a strange shape. It had strange dynamics and how it worked. It basically made it difficult to say exactly what it was because it didn't fit into the existing framework of any of our known objects in the solar system, or within the universe, rather. And Avi Loeb was one of the scientists who tried to approach the problem. And he got a lot of news because he sort of presented the problem as being possibly an alien spacecraft, interstellar voyage that was looking for life. He presented this idea as a possibility. And it's one of those things, well, sure, it's an intriguing idea and it's possible. In the same way that me seeing a drone in the sky but not knowing it's a drone, I could say it's possible it's a UFO. But without more information, that leap in logic is just completely fallacious. He's gotten a lot of attention, where he even wrote a book that I honestly was so compelled to read and discuss because I so wanted to address a lot of his claims. I think he's a perfect example of one of those scientists who misrepresents the science and sort of also simultaneously in misrepresenting it, he talks down about the scientists in the actual community who have spent their lives dedicated to this type of search for alien life. And it's all because his claim that was an alien spacecraft was shot down, and it was rightfully so. I mean, it might possibly be that, but that is just a huge leap in logic from saying we don't know exactly what it was because it doesn't fit our existing models of different existing objects. One thing that we learn about him is that he actually had a history of proposing we build this type of interstellar spacecraft. So he sees this thing, which could possibly be the very thing that he spent years advocating for, and it sort of calls back to earlier when I was talking about how when we want to believe something so badly, we find a reason to believe it. I think it's the perfect example of a modern day take on UFOs. We see someone who sees something, doesn't know what it is, and wants to believe it. The difference is that he's an elevated figure and he has a more esoteric framework for this UFO encounter. The point I want to make is that it really highlights the importance of how we need to make sure we're very careful the things we believe in, how quick we are to believe in it, and why we believe in it. And this book as a whole, I think, does a really good job explaining not just why UFOs as a major concept is just not a reasonable idea. It allows the reader then to be directed to more justifiable, more reasonable things to be inspired by. There's still a chance for life in the universe. It seems not just like a chance, but almost likely. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be excited about this concept. It's just important to measure the expectations of the public. Do I think there's intelligent life in the universe? Besides us, I don't know. I definitely believe there's life, but the obstacles in line of that life reaching true intelligence, let alone the ability to communicate with us, is just so massive that I could see it going either way. We could be the first, and we could not be. I don't know, and until we get more information, I'm open to both possibilities. If I had to pick a side, perhaps I'd be more inclined to lean towards, yes, there's intelligent life. But that's not the same as me believing that there's an abundance of microbial life, which I do believe. I think we are going to find microbial life, probably in my lifetime. I mentioned a couple missions that are going out right now. Europa Clipper is a good example. They're sending basically a spacecraft to orbit Europa, one of the 3 moons of Jupiter. It's an ocean world that has more liquid water than even on Earth. A lot more, actually. There's also a strong reason to suspect that within that ocean, it has likely hydrothermal vents. We're talking like heated rock at the base of that ocean that feeds in not only energy, but also resources. This is basically just means that there's a viable path for life to arise. If you're interested in hearing more about that, I could direct you to a few things. Just ask in the comments. I'd be happy to. But it's really compelling because if you ever heard of the Cassini mission and it going to a moon of Saturn, which was Enceladus, much smaller than Europa, but it has 3 giant stripes on it that are basically tidal rips, and it's spewing out water. And that is like it's a perfect example of a plume on an icy world. There is some tenuous evidence of similar things existing on Europa to a lesser extent, and that's why we're calling it Europa Clipper. I say we, the scientific community at large, because the goal is hopefully to get closer and to identify sources of plumes, of outing of water from the ocean that they can basically clip, just grab a piece of and sample. It's a very compelling investigation because Europa is one of the best cases to look for life. It's one of the best habitable environments outside of Earth in the solar system, perhaps the best. The other mission I mentioned is Dragonfly going to Titan. Titan is another moon of Saturn. It is the second largest moon in the solar system. It is so big that while it does have an ocean, the pressure is so high that when you get down to the base of that ocean, it doesn't touch the rock core. It instead has a very thick layer of high pressure ice, which means the ocean isn't quite as exciting as a habitable environment as Europa. But what is exciting is on its surface. Titan is so big that it has a dense atmosphere, about the same density as our atmosphere. And there's a really fascinating chemistry going on there. Chemistry like the early Earth chemistry. And if you're interested in hearing about that, this is that's the topic of the early Earth chemistry, the origin of life. It's touched on very briefly in this, so it's a good place to introduce that idea. But that's going on Titan. And when I mention a crater on Titan, basically, a giant thing from space hits the planet, it creates a big hole, but because it's an icy world, it has a big puddle of liquid water. Now, it's not going to stay liquid, maybe decades to centuries, possibly thousands of years before it's entirely frozen. And you might be thinking, well, how could life possibly do much? Who knows? We don't know much about the origin of life. But, decades even, let alone centuries or thousands of years, or more time for an experiment, a natural laboratory, to do an experiment than we've ever done on Earth, which is why that is such a compelling investigation unto itself, where we're sending a giant quadcopter the size of a car with giant blades that are going to fly because it's such a dense atmosphere and the gravity is so that it can do that. It's a revolutionary mission, in my opinion, just really unlike anything we've ever seen before. I'm obviously biased, love Titan, love icy worlds, love Dragonfly. The point is that this is a chance to understand the origin of life, how we went from chemistry to life, assuming that's what happened. Obviously, this is pre-assuming that life did originate on its own and not sourced by a higher being. If it's a problem you have, you be your own person. But, these are things in form of science, search for life. These are real questions that we are actively investigating, and they're real things to be excited about. This book necessarily isn't just about that, but I think that's what it's really good at, and why I'm so excited about it, is just reviewing the thing that gets the most attention, while simultaneously giving attention to the things that really deserve that attention. And hopefully now you can see, if you made it to the end, thank you so much, appreciate you, love you. You can appreciate why this book worked so perfectly for me. It just touches on that which I love most in the world, is my passion, is what drives me in my science, is that search for life. I am a geophysicist, but it's from a habitable lens. We try to understand how the worlds work in terms of for life, in terms of how that intersects with life. That is just a question I'm fundamentally interested in, not to mention just, cosmology at large. But still, that's why this book worked. It touched on the topics I love, but that's not all it is, because I can acknowledge when a book touches on something I love while also being just mediocre. This book does it in what I feel like is just a really well done way. The author approached the problem in a very skillful way, in a very effective way, in a book that I feel like is just honestly basically perfect for me. I really, really hope if you made it to the end of this that you give this a shot. I don't know how many people will click on this review. I feel like either I'll get a bunch of hate from people who are obsessed with UFOs, or it just won't get many hits, because this is feels like a fringe book. It's not something that's getting much attention, even though the author is fairly popular. But I'm going to be uplifting this book as hard as I can for the foreseeable future, and I just really, really hope you consider giving it a shot. Listening to the audiobook in addition to using the ARC, the advanced copy, the physical ARC that I got here. And the audiobook is honestly, I think it does a great job. I think it's above average in my estimation. So the audiobook's also a great choice. So now that we're here, thanks again for watching. Tell me, have you read this book? And if you haven't, have I managed to convince you to do so? I want to hear that I have, please. And if you have any questions about any of the topics in this book or any of the tangential stuff that I'm more familiar with from a scientific perspective, or just looking for more material in the field of astrobiology, let me know. I've thought about the books before. I would love to get people excited about it if I can. Don't know how good I am at this, but I still love the opportunity to talk about it and that you listened. I really appreciate it. I hope you all have a great day. Stay safe, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.